we can't say truth. Truth is a hate crime against Marxism.
This is not the question for us mortals, God. I'm Anastasia Martinkevich.
I'm Alexander Salkolsky.
My entire family was deported to Kazakh Gulag.
Nikolai Tarkovsky was a teacher.
Boris Komarov, Article 52.
I'm Fyodor Andrusov.
My father was Siberian.
Pieces of human waste.
Come here. Hey, you. What is your name?
My name is Alexander.
I can see through her all my people, dispossessed men, dispossessed women, dispossessed people.
You're my Arctic flower.
God, give me the wisdom to know what I can do. See, political correctness isn't Russian, it's foreign. Karl Marx wasn't Russian.
They want to exterminate intelligence. Make sure we don't pass our wisdom down to our children.
300 kilometers through the snow in the mountain ranges.
Olga, Mama.
The USSR genocide from 1930 to 1933 is called the Holodomor genocide. It exterminated an estimated 10 million people. It is the largest genocide in European history and the largest genocide in 20th century Europe. Why did the USSR do the Holodomor genocide? Well, it begins with Ukrainian nationalism. In 1918, the Ukraine nation declared its independence from the globalist internationalist USSR. The USSR invaded Ukraine and began a 4-year war called the Ukrainian War of Independence. In Izvestia on December 2nd, 1933, they stated that Ukrainian nationalism is the main enemy. They wanted to destroy the Ukrainian people. The main goal was to eliminate all of the cultural elements of Ukraine to create one single Soviet national unity, to create one Soviet ideal person. When did the USSR do the Holodomor genocide? The height of the Holodomor genocide was 1932 to 1933. It occurred within the collectivization period of 1928 to 1935. It can be said that the Holodomor genocide occurred from 1930 to 1933, with a peak period of 1932 to 1933. This is one of the horrific photographs from the Holodomor genocide, the starvation and extermination of the Ukrainian nation. Concentration camp photo from concentration camp Ukraine. It was forbidden to leave Ukraine, by rail, road, any method. There was armed guards around Ukraine. The vast majority, 95% of the victims of the Holodomor were white, race, and Christian. This is considered a white genocide because of that. This is a letter from Stalin to Kaganovich, putting Kaganovich in charge of the Ukraine. As you can see, Molotov is second, and Chubar and Kosyur are to be removed from the Holodomor. Ukraine was one giant concentration camp. A concentration camp photo from Ukraine during the starvation, during collectivization. How did the USSR do the Holodomor genocide? It was under Soviet communist collectivization. They confiscated all of the crops, the lands, the food, and they starved the people. It is estimated that from 1929 to 1935, 10 million were killed. The West hasn't seen the photographs of the extreme starvation, the genocide of the Ukrainian people during the Holodomor genocide. These horrific photos look like they are from a concentration camp, and indeed, the entire Ukraine was a concentration camp. There was armed guards shooting anybody who attempted to leave the mass starvation, the mass extermination. Horrific concentration camp-like photos have not been seen before in any broad aspect in the West. So it brings us to statistics on the Holodomor genocide. We're going to take a look here at statistician R.J. Rummel and his wide-ranging and highly detailed accounting. His estimate is a high of 10 million people were exterminated in the Holodomor. Horrific photos that could be from a concentration camp, and indeed were, for the entire Ukraine was a concentration camp, with armed guards preventing anybody from leaving Ukraine. And the world stood by and did nothing. The world did absolutely nothing. Starving people looking down the pipeline of history at us, wondering why the world does nothing as millions are being exterminated in the Holodomor genocide. The object was Ukrainian nationalism had to be destroyed by internationalist socialism. The height of the genocide was an 18-month period from 1932 to 1933. It was the destruction of Ukrainian nationalism by the internationalist USSR. From 25 million farmers, 10 million were exterminated. These photos could be from a concentration camp, and indeed they are. For the Ukraine, the entire Ukraine was in effect a concentration camp, with armed guards preventing anybody from leaving and shooting them. This young starving girl is looking at us and wondering why we don't help. Why doesn't the West know about this? These images from the Holodomor are horrific. Skin and bones. Millions of people, 10 million people, exterminated because they wanted to be nationalists. Here is statistician R.J. Rummel's overall estimate of the collectivization period, with a high of 24 million, a median of 12 million. And that includes the deaths outside of Ukraine. These are rare mass grave photos from Ukraine during the Holodomor genocide. Mounds of bodies covered in dirt and lime. More photos, archival photos. More archival photos of the Holodomor genocide, of mass graves. This is a photo of a mass grave of Holodomor genocide victims with the Christian crosses in the mounds of dirt. These photos aren't shown in Hollywood movies. In fact, Hollywood has made no film on the Holodomor genocide. This is the collectivization period from statistician R.J. Rummel from 1928 to 1935. A median range of 11 million and a high of 22 million. Now in Ukraine that's going to be a median of 5 million with a high of 10 million. Why didn't the West know? Well, there was some reporting on the Holodomor genocide, most notably by Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist working for the Manchester Guardian. His human conscience did not allow him to ignore the genocide. Gareth Jones had the courage and the moral conscience to report on the Holodomor genocide. Gareth Jones newspaper article. His article appeared in the Manchester Guardian, a New York newspaper, and a Berlin newspaper. The horrific photos of mass starvation and genocide in the Soviet Union were never shown in the West. Statistician R.J. Rummel begins a very detailed analysis of the various sources for the entire collectivization period, of which Holodomor is a subset of. This is the first page of the R.J. Rummel tables relating to the Holodomor genocide and collectivization. A photo of whites being exterminated on the ground. Another white race person starving as though in a concentration camp. Statistician R.J. Rummel on his second page of his charts. Statistician R.J. Rummel with his analysis a very comprehensive analysis of all of the figures, components, categories in the collectivization period, of which the Holodomor is a part of. Horrific photos of children starving, being exterminated. This could be from a concentration camp, from a death camp, and it was. These are the bodies from Soviet starvation. The genocide of white people in the Marxist USSR was massive and covered an overall death rate of 65 million. Statistician R.J. Rummel, in the third page of his statistical analysis, begins to come to the Ukrainian component of the collectivization genocide, which is called the Holodomor. As we can see, the high is 10 million. A very detailed and well-documented website of statistician R.J. Rummel is seen here. Shocking and horrific photos. Photos from a concentration camp called Ukraine. The death, the murder of 10 million people, ruthlessly starved to death by the globalist internationalist USSR, intent on crushing Ukrainian nationalism. Statistician R.J. Rummel's collectivization genocide, of which the Ukraine Holodomor genocide occurred. If we look closely, we can see, again, it's 10 million people as the high maximum estimate, with a median estimate of 5 million. A photo from a young girl, starved. Horrific photos. This could be from a concentration camp photo. This could be from a concentration camp, and indeed it was. Ukraine had been turned into a concentration camp. The people were starved to death. A young child who had been killed in genocide by the Marxist USSR. Brutal and ruthless, starving the children. Statistician R.J. Rummel, in his wide-ranging and detailed analysis of Soviet genocide, comes to the consolidated Ukraine deaths as 10 million as a high. Photo of young kids starving to death in the Soviet Union under conditions of genocide. Heaps of bodies, as though from a concentration camp, and indeed, all of the Soviet Union, and especially Ukraine, was a concentration camp. The bodies are being thrown down the ravine and burned. Not many movies have been made on the Holodomor genocide. What you're seeing here are stills from a 1991 Ukraine movie that was made with all of the Soviet camera gear after the Soviets pulled out in 1991. It's a cast of thousands. It's one of the best films on the Holodomor genocide. Holodomor is recognized as genocide. Dr. Raphael Lemkin in 1953, in a speech in New York City, described the Holodomor as the classic example of Soviet genocide. Raphael Lemkin wrote a book called Soviet Genocide in Ukraine. It remains an unpublished manuscript. Dr. Raphael Lemkin, the inventor of the word genocide, said, "What I want to speak about is perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation." On the Holodomor Museum website in Kiev, Ukraine, they talk about the UN Genocide Convention and how the Holodomor genocide conforms to it. Ukraine President Viktor Yushchenko restated that the Holodomor was a genocide according to Dr. Raphael Lemkin. Of course, this infuriated a lot of the supremacists across the world. The Holodomor Museum in Kiev, Ukraine has an interesting webpage citing that on December 9th, 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Genocide Convention, and according to Article 2, the Holodomor genocide conforms to that. Of course, this raised a lot of fury amongst the supremacists, deniers of the Holodomor genocide. Ever since the Holodomor occurred, there have been denials that it was genocide, going back to Walter Duranty of the New York Times, to our contemporary Anne Applebaum, who denies that the Holodomor was a genocide. We see here Anne Applebaum denying that the Holodomor was a genocide, despite the fact that Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the word genocide, stated that it was indeed a genocide. And here we have Soviet Politburo member Grigory Zinoviev, born Applebaum, and he committed USSR genocide. He spoke in a speech that 10% of the people must be exterminated. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, flew over to Kiev, Ukraine, to meet with the Ukrainian government and dictated to them that they should not link the Ukrainian Holodomor genocide with any other genocide, essentially telling them not to use the word genocide with regard to the Holodomor. The ADL, Abraham Foxman, told the Ukrainian government, don't do it. Do not refer to the Holodomor as a genocide. Do not link it to any other genocide. He essentially was telling them what they could and what they could not say with regards to their own genocide, the Holodomor genocide of 10 million Ukrainians. And they had a smug look on their face over the deaths of 10 million Ukrainians. Absolutely disgusting. The retribution for the Holodomor genocide being recognized by the nation of Ukraine was swift. The president of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, the destruction of Kiev followed. The president was ousted in a fraudulent, corrupt election, and Kiev was burned to the ground. These are more images of the aftermath of what happened when Ukraine refused to be silent on calling the Holodomor a genocide. So who was behind the removal of Yushchenko? Victoria Nuland was Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs at the United States Department of State. She held the rank of Career Ambassador, the highest diplomatic rank in the United States Foreign Service. It was Victoria Nuland who engineered the coup in Ukraine, which ousted Yushchenko and brought in Yanukovych, who was oddly pro-Russian. She knew this would cause an uprising and a reaction, giving her the excuse to put in her man, fellow supremacist Yatsenyuk. The criminals of the Holodomor genocide, who were they? Who were the perpetrators? On the Holodomor Museum website in Kiev, Ukraine, they highlight Kaganovich, Lazar Moiseyevich Kaganovich. On 13th of January 2010, the Kiev Appellate Court posthumously found Kaganovich guilty of genocide against Ukrainians during the Holodomor. Again, Kaganovich, not Molotov, personally oversaw grain confiscations. The Kiev Appellate Court posthumously found Kaganovich guilty of genocide against the Ukrainian nation. There are many memorials on the Holodomor genocide today, and they are increasing every year. This is the most famous Holodomor genocide memorial in Kiev, Ukraine. This is a bronze statue of a starving girl. Every year around the world, people hold Holodomor genocide memorials. They light candles for the millions of people. Holodomor memorials are being built all around the world. They represent the largest genocide in human history. The genocide of 10 million, mostly white people, in the Ukraine from 1932 to 1933. A beautiful bronze sculpture at a Holodomor memorial. These are the artworks that we must show the next generations. Take your school classroom on a bus to these Holodomor memorials, which are about remembering the greatest genocide of the 20th century. Here is a Holodomor statue, a smaller replica of the larger one in Kiev, Ukraine. Another beautiful Holodomor statue. A starving bronze girl holding a sheaf of grain. Education for the Holodomor genocide must start with the young, with the kids. If history is not to repeat its terrible tragedies, the Holodomor genocide must be remembered by the young, by the kids, by the students. 95% of the victims in the Holodomor genocide were white race people. The Holodomor genocide was of white people it was a white genocide. This is an important fact that must be impressed upon history. This is the Canadian Holodomor bus. It tours Canadian high schools with a mobile theater on the inside, an entire classroom with video projection and a theater. Students and faculty study hard the details and the facts from original documents in the theater inside the Holodomor bus that tours Canadian schools. Please invite the Holodomor bus down to the United States to visit U.S. high schools and teach the truth about the genocide of the Holodomor. The Holodomor genocide is studied by teachers and faculty at schools across Canada. The Holodomor Genocide Bus, the National Awareness Tour, is supported immensely by many Ukrainians in Canada. This is the modern high-tech Holodomor Museum in Kiev, Ukraine, where the next generation learns about the immense suffering and genocide of 10 million Ukrainian people, of 10 million white people. The Holodomor Museum in Kiev, Ukraine has a board which meets upon the best way to educate the public. It's the struggle for consciousness. They are replenishing their collection of the memories about the Holodomor every year. If you are in Kiev, Ukraine, it's important, and it's even vital, to stop by the Holodomor Museum. Activism for Holodomor Genocide. Canadian students call to fire a professor who denies the Holodomor. That professor was a member of the Communist Party in Canada. This is my banner for the Holodomor that I posted outside of the CBS television studios in Studio City, California, in Hollywood essentially. We must never forget the USSR genocide of the Holodomor was of 10 million, mostly white people, were exterminated in genocide.